Hello, thanks for joining me again, astrologer Patrick Arundell. Today I'm in front of Shrewsbury Castle. I want to talk today about Katie Hopkins, who's a kind of shock jock approach to her political views and interactions, whether it's been through popular newspapers or more recently through Twitter. And of course Twitter have made the decision to take her off the platform. Now, it's not for me to comment exactly on her personal outlook, but what I wanted to do was to engage with the astrology to see why this event has just happened now, because I feel it will be in her chart. There will be some clues, either in her natal chart or in her progressions or directions. So I'm going to take you back to Astral Towers HQ to look through this with you. It'll just be a quickie, about 15 minutes, and just see what we find, because I think it could be really interesting. Thank you. Hello, thanks so much for joining me back at Astral Towers HQ. So we're going to look at this deep dive into Katie Hopkins. Now, Katie Hopkins is a political and social commentator who tends to shoot from the lip, as they say. Now, I'm not going to comment particularly on her strand of politics. I want to understand more what has motivated her to develop this kind of persona, this public persona, but also to understand why the decision may have been taken by Twitter at this time in terms of the astrology. Now, I don't have a time of birth for Katie Hopkins. The only source of information I could see out there was based on AstroTheme, a well-known French website, and that's been generated at 12 midday. Astrologers often use 12 midday because obviously it's halfway through the day to get some kind of idea of where the major planets are positioned. But when the moon moves so quickly, that can cause some issues, and also it changes the ascendant a lot and therefore the house system. So I haven't got the time to really delve into or rectify her natal horoscope in detail. But what I have done is erected 3 charts for the day, one at 1 a.m, because that's fairly early into the day. I've done one at midday, the same as AstroTheme, and also I've done one later in the day. And I think it's the one later in the day which is probably likely to be much more about her. But let's look at this 1 a.m. chart. The moon, which moves so quickly through the day, is conjunct Venus, but in this particular ascendant, now my belief with her was that she would have a Scorpio ascendant. That's before I put her chart on onto the computer, and there is something interesting to tell you about her sun in Aquarius. But yeah, this chart has a Scorpio ascendant, so that was a sensory take on my part. But the moon and Venus in the 4th house makes for a very gentle individual, or someone who treasures their home. The home means everything to them and their family. And the whole spread of the midpoint, Black Moon, Lilith, the Moon, Venus, Jupiter, and also Ceres, all in the 4th house. And that just doesn't feel right for me. So let's go through to the midday chart. Now this makes her her ascendant in Gemini. And that's interesting because she does commentate on things. So that kind of fits a bit more together, but it does put the sun in the 10th house. Now that makes a lot of sense as well, because that's very much to do with someone who has quite a high profile. The midpoint is also in the 10th house. Why don't I think it's this? Well, mainly because by midday her moon is so close to Venus in the 11th house, which is very much to do with the collective. It's a very Aquarius energy, very friendly. Someone with moon conjunct Venus in the 11th house in Pisces, I think would be someone who really wanted to build lots of different friendships and be very active in social interaction. I feel that Katie Hopkins' drive isn't in that direction. Then if we go through to the 11:55 p.m. time, when I put this up, which was something I picked out because I just had a hunch that the moon would be moving forward, so it would move away from Venus, because I don't think she's a moon conjunct Venus person. I mean, it's still conjunct by 6 degrees, but the key here is that the moon is conjunct Jupiter. And Jupiter is about opinion in some ways, because it's not just governs the sign of Pisces, where obviously it's happy in her chart, but it also governs the sign of Sagittarius, which can be about big comment, big points of view. So she has Moon conjunct Jupiter, but they move into the 5th house, which is much more outgoing. It's still actually quite warm and friendly, but it takes it away from this Venus, and it does leave the Venus and the Sun and the midpoint in the 4th house. And I don't know very much about Katie Hopkins. I remember seeing her on The Apprentice years ago, and then a few years ago she obviously popped up more as a social commentator, had various columns in papers and so on, but she's not someone I've had a great deal of kind of awareness to, but I have heard that her family is very important to her, so that seems to fit. But this more outgoing energy for Jupiter and the Moon, that works much better for me. But what really made me excited about this time is where this ascendant, it is in Scorpio again, rather than being in Gemini as it was at midday. But look what it's conjunct. It's conjunct Uranus, which is exalted in Scorpio, but that's just in the 12th house at this time. So the 12th house is very much about the kind of subterranean area of life, but Uranus is very much to do with being quite shocking in some ways, especially on the ascendant. One of the things with Scorpio people is that they have a reputation of being quite private, and yes, they can be very private about their own situations, but actually very pointed in what they think about other people. So Uranus on the ascendant, how she goes about expressing herself, it's very quick, it's fast, but it's not necessarily always considered, I feel, Uranus on the ascendant. But maybe she's bringing things up from the depths that some of us may find unpalatable. But also, I think that more penetrating side of her nature is reflected by Pluto, the co-ruler of Scorpio, which is actually in a very good angle with Mercury, and in this time Mercury is in the 3rd house, and that's perfect for journalism. So she has a very penetrating way of expressing her ideas through the prism of air, because Pluto's in Libra in this time, and Mercury is exalted in Aquarius in the 2nd. It's exalted in Aquarius, but it also governs the 2nd decan where her Mercury is. Now it's retrograde, so this is someone who's thinking deeper down as far as she sees it, and she makes penetrating observations through the prism of air, so kind of shock jock techniques. 3rd house journalism, the 11th house is commenting on person kind, and with that Uranus on the ascendant, that's that kind of pugnacious, to the point, sometimes harsh, sometimes quite startling comment, which might row against sort of wider public opinion. Now, the other thing about her chart is that she does have Saturn, the planet of restriction and limitation, but also discipline, in the 9th house at this time, which is about those higher values, which is about publishing. It's about finding a wider audience for our views. So very Sagittarius. But the thing is that Saturn's actually in detriment in Cancer. Cancer is obviously very caring, but the 9th house for Saturn can point towards litigation, and I understand that she went through some litigation with a social blogger called Jack Monroe, who does kind of cooking stuff, and it's pretty popular, I understand. And they apparently Katie Hopkins said something that wasn't proven to be true, because that's what the courts decided, but Jack Hopkins gave her a way to sort of pay off this in a small amount of money, which I think she was going to give to charity. Katie Hopkins refused to do it, and so apparently she lost her house. So Saturn in the 9th house. This chart makes sense, doesn't it? But also her Saturn is right next by 1 degree to Sirius, the brightest star in the zodiac, which can lead to people having a very high profile. So her opinions, which are very conservative, it seems to me, are very much in the public eye in the sign of Cancer, which can be very conservative. It's a cardinal sign, so it's very much to do with having a kind of a voice. It's a lead-in sign. It's very underestimated for that Cancer. But guess what? Saturn is opposite Mars, which is exalted, ironically, in Capricorn, but Mars is in the third house. People who have Mars in the third house or Mars in Gemini often end up as journalists. Do you remember Alex Ferguson? We bound not to forget Alex Ferguson. Well, he had Mars in Gemini, and I bet you if he hadn't been a football manager, he would have been a writer, because he had that way of saying very punchy, pugnacious things. So a lot of political commentators have Mars in Gemini. So Mars in the third house is a very Gemini energy, but they're in opposition. So that gives this person, that pugnaciousness, that very strident nature of wanting to push across their ideas. So Mars in the third house is everyday ideas. The ninth house is those higher ideals, the bigger trends and strands that affect us all. But it also can see a kind of almost relishing conflict and, wanting to take on challenges. You can also see her struggling a little bit to balance her masculine and feminine sides, I feel. So obviously with the Cancer energy is much more feminine, so having the harsh, restrictive Saturn there is quite a problem. Now she also has Pluto, the planet of transformation, intersecting this opposition in a T-square. Well, in fact, actually, we've kind of got a grand cardinal cross, because Juno, which is very much, did you know Juno is about, sorry, I couldn't resist that terrible joke, but Juno is about how we relate, and how she relates is in Aries. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Quick fire, forceful. So she's got a T-square between Saturn, Mars, Pluto and Juno. A grand cardinal cross between those four positions. So this is a person who, really has a kind of might is right attitude to situations, I feel. But it could make her a little bit obsessive at times. And I wonder if a lot of this sort of rabble-rousing actually hides in some ways a slightly less assured nature. But anyway, so what I get from this chart is that ascendant is probably going to be about right, not just because it puts Uranus on it. I'd instinctively thought that she had a Scorpio ascendant. She obviously has Saturn opposite Mars throughout this day, whichever houses they're in, but the ninth, third house, that just really fits for me. So what else is going on in this chart? Well, the Sun at 24 degrees Aquarius, there is a tendency to see sun signs in very one-dimensional ways. Each zodiac sign has a higher plane and it has a lower plane. So one of the downside of Aquarius energy can be detachment in not necessarily a warm or connected way. So if we think about where her sun is, and we take into account the 12th harmonic, so that's dwarves in Indian astrology, Vedic astrology, her sun's actually ruled by Scorpio. Incredible. So my instinct was really borne out with that. So that desire to sort of punch out, be defensive, sort of get a stick and lift up things and peer underneath. She seems to have a kind of desire to do that kind of stuff. So it is true to say that her sun is in the last third or the last decan of Aquarius, which is about Venus, but that may just give her that desire to relate. And of course, it's still an air sign, but it is in the fourth house. So the sun in the fourth house can be quite defensive. And then she has her midheaven on this chart in Leo. Well, this is definitely a person who's craved attention, because anyone, in my humble opinion, who goes on The Apprentice it is about getting on telly. They may have some good business ideas these days. I haven't watched it for years because I don't think it's a serious business program. It's about sales kind of type people. It's just very, very bitchy. It's not my cup of tea at all. So anyone who goes on that show wants attention. So again, this chart points towards this time being about right. But it means that her midheaven is opposite her Mercury. So she's pinging her ideas up into the ether to get more attention for them, I feel. Also, her Saturn quincunx Mercury, so integrating the higher potential of the ninth house with her quick thinking thoughts. Her thoughts come very quickly, I feel. Sometimes I don't feel that maybe she considers quite as carefully as she might what she says, and that impulsiveness is underlined by the fact that the ascendant and Uranus would therefore be squaring up Mercury. So that's a very much shoot from the hip, lip type of persona. So that's just giving you a flavour. I think now what we can do is I can show you just very, very briefly the tri-wheel of the 3 times. So the inside wheel is the time, I think, late in the day, and that puts Jupiter conjunct the moon. I would imagine with people that she really likes, she is a very warm person with the people she likes. But I'm just convinced it's not these times. So the midday puts Venus and Moon exactly conjunct. I just don't believe that is the case. And just after midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, the Moon's yet to come on to Venus in the 4th house. She would be someone much more shy and retiring around the very base of her existence, whereas this chart gives her the extroversion and the confidence really to go out there and do what she does. Now what I wanted to show you now was the quad wheel. So if we take the inner wheel is the nativity, as I think it is, around about 11:55 p.m. on that day. We then got her progressed chart and then her directions. The progressed chart is particularly important in terms of the Sun, which is now at 9 degrees in Aries. It's particularly important in terms of the ascendant, which is just into the sign of Sagittarius and has been for about 3 or 4 years. So that's very much to do with broadening your sort of appeal and talking about big subjects, if you like. She's got her progressed moon, which is also very important, just about to come onto her ascendant. Now, I do have a theory about what's going to happen to Katie Hopkins, which I'll reveal in a little bit. But what I wanted to do was just show you her progress chart in isolation. So this is based on the 11:55 p.m. chart. And the big thing for me, you can see that moon coming onto the ascendant if this time is right. But the fascinating thing for me about this chart is Pluto. So Pluto has been in her 10th house for some time. The 10th house is very much about where we elevate our profile. It's where we get power. People with Pluto in the 10th house, including my good self, often end up in the spotlight whether we want to or not. I have it in my natal chart. This is her progress chart. But look at where the Sun is. It's at 9 degrees, as I mentioned before, Aries. So we've got a direct opposition between the two. And she's going to find that very hard to escape from. Obviously, the Sun moves quicker than Pluto. So it is going to move on. But she's still got Jupiter opposite Pluto. And people who've got Jupiter opposite Pluto are ambitious in not always a particularly pleasant way. It's very grabbing. Or can be. They can lose sight of humanity because they're so desirous of attention, success and acclaim. I'm not saying that necessarily would be true of this person because I don't know her, but certainly that opposition between Pluto and the Sun is very telling, especially as what happened in terms of apparently losing her home, because Pluto, as you know, can be about destruction, it can be about death, but it also can be about rebirth. But I think at the moment, certainly in the next few months, there's going to be certainly in the next few weeks anyway, there's going to be a recoiling from what's happened with Twitter, I feel. But that was the big aspect that really stuck out for me on her progress chart. So if we go to the big wheel, what is the most important aspect that I can see here? Well, without doubt, it is the directed position of Pluto, which is at 24 degrees in Scorpio. And look where her sun is in her natal chart, 24 degrees. And Pluto is in her first house. It has been for quite a long time. So she has been someone who's been on quite a journey for about 21 years to raise her profile. It's been an ascending desire for her to be very individualistic in her approach. And that's quite interesting because people who've got suns in the fourth house are usually quite concerned with their immediate environment, security, family, all that kind of stuff, which I understand. You know, she's got children, I think. She got together with someone a few years ago. So that's all been building up for her. But that right angle, any astrologer will tell you, that is really critical, because when Pluto is exactly, and it is absolutely exactly square her sun, that does point towards something really breaking down quite significantly in her life. It could be her career, it could be what happened with that house, it could be around relationships, it could be around even her sense of personal emotional security and physical well-being. So Pluto square the sun is a tough one. But also in her progress chart, you can see that Mars is coming onto her sun. So that's a very defensive position. There's only 3 degrees apart, and Pluto's picking up on that as well. So that's quite challenging. The other thing that came up for me is that when we have the solar eclipse tomorrow, Sunday, it's going to be on the Earth point, which is 0 degrees Cancer, which is in her 8th house of finance. And that is going to be in a direct square with Jupiter, okay, maybe a couple of degrees apart, but in the 5th house of self-expression. So her progressed Jupiter, which is not far away from her sun, that's going to be squared by the solar eclipse. So for the next 6 months, I do think financially there's going to be quite a hit on this person. So I could go into greater and greater detail about this chart. I mean, in terms of when the decision was made, it probably wasn't made specifically yesterday, it was just announced. But in terms of her situation, look at where Mars is today and look at where I feel her natal moon is. Moon conjunct Mars is a very turbulent, potentially very turbulent, because if you think they're polar opposites in what they represent, Mars is about masculinity and drive and determination, and the moon is more about our home, our emotions. So that's really attacking her home emotions, her well-being. Also, the moving and transiting Mars is on her natal Jupiter at the moment. Now that can sort of give people a big desire to, you know, sort of big themselves up, if you like. But I think it's quite significant when the decision came that it was absolutely on her moon. Now I could talk in more detail about this. For example, the transit in Uranus, we don't take into account the progressed, the directed moon, but it is on Jupiter, which is about justice, and it is again about legalities. And Uranus is about those sudden changes or those dramatic switches of mood. And that Uranus is on her Venus and her Jupiter in the 7th house of relating. And her Uranus is also going through a Uranus opposition, which everyone goes through at the kind of age she is. So we have 2 generational things, Neptune square Neptune and then Uranus opposite Uranus. So this is her kind of, you know, very acerbic, shock jock, confrontational approach coming back to haunt her a little bit, because although it's 7 degrees now, that Uranus is going to be actually rewinding, and it's going to come back into an opposition. And so I feel, because it's the 7th house of relating for her, as it's gone over a 7th house cusp based on this time, that's happened this year. So that means that kind of taking on a more challenging and provocative approach to the way that she shares her ideas, which she may have got away with in the past, has created a rebound, because the 7th house is more Libran in its response. Now, she is going to have a nodal reverse return, which will have last happened to her her nodal return would have actually happened about 8 years ago. She's got the reverse nodal return. It's going to happen in about a year and 4 months time for her, and that might be a kind of triggering point to new beginnings. But I'm going to say something a bit controversial now, because I think it's going to be controversial, but I feel that what Katie Hopkins is going to do is use the energy of Mars's arrival in the sign of Aries, which occurs on the 28th of June this year, and because it's going to be picking up on her Jupiter and also her progressed and directed Sun, and also a part of Fortune, really quite quickly in her 5th house, I think what this person will do is start producing her own material from her home. So she'll probably do digital radio. She may appear on other websites that have got more of a right approach. Might is right, but right-wing approach. I think that she is going to sort of rise up a little bit again, but clearly being taken down off Twitter is a huge hit for her. And the other thing with that solar eclipse is that it does square up with her midheaven in the 11th house, which in her progressed and directed chart. So that's about her desire to be in the public eye and also her future destiny. So the next 6 months I think are going to be shaky, but I think there's going to be something she tries to do. It's whether people will search her out in the way that she might want, and obviously there will be a lot of commentators on Twitter that are pleased that she's not on there, but it seems to me that there's generally a lot of hate and negative talk that goes on in general in society. So the interesting thing about what Twitter's done is that it's a kind of pushback against this kind of stuff, and that's going to be really intriguing how that plays out, because obviously some people are very unhappy about her being taken off, especially with some of the quite incendiary things that a certain person with ginger or orange hair says. But for now, I think that gives you quite a good take, I feel, of why this situation has happened. I think it is Mars on her moon, it's Pluto squaring her Sun, it's that solar eclipse squaring her midheaven, and going back to her natal chart at 11:55, there is just one other thing I forgot to tell you about. Yeah, Sirius here, up here, it's the most sparkling star in the sky. So having Saturn there in the 9th house, if we think about her chart in terms of Hellenistic astrology, we look at her chart in terms of whole signs, it still means Saturn is in the 9th house, but in her perfection year that she's in, because she's 45, so just looking, the perfection year is 9, so the 9th house is governed very much about information broadcasting, media, but crucially legalities. So having Saturn in your 9th perfection year is not good, I don't think, for peace of mind. And so I think generally that's another reason why this has all come up to a boil. Also, if we look at her natal chart just briefly, Markab, which can bestow glittering prizes on people. The time I feel that she is means that she has Markab conjunct her moon, but also her Jupiter. But this can also be known as the star of sorrow. So she's lost her home as well. So that's it. A very quick run through on Katie Hopkins. I hope you found it enjoyable, but I do think her ascendant is definitely Scorpionic, and of course her dwarf with Scorpio in Aquarius. Having that Uranus really fits for me on the ascendant. Having that 10th house in Leo really fits. Having That's Sirius in the 9th house on Saturn, opposite Mars in the 3rd house. Very pugnacious, really someone who wants to rock things. But I do think this is a person who can sort of speak before she thinks. Oh, there's one other thing that I've just remembered. So if we go to a secondary progress chart and we look at the midpoint, she's actually got Saturn. The move in Saturn is only a few degrees away from her midpoint in a secondary progress chart as well. So that's another pinch point which is affecting her. I've just remembered something else. She's got Saturn in a quincunx with Mercury. I'm not sure if I mentioned that before, but that... No, I know what it was. I beg your pardon. Her midpoint on this chart at this time is 9 degrees Pisces, which is in quincunx with Pluto. So this is someone who finds it difficult to relate in an emotional way, a joined up way, I feel. So her inflammatory opinions, not necessarily of a person that's entirely at peace or in balance within herself. I'm sure that she would not agree with me at all. But I do feel that at the very heart of her world, she probably does have a warmth towards the ones she loves. And as I said, with that Mercury in a excellent angle with Pluto, she does have powers of penetrative thinking. It's just whether you agree with her ideas or not. You may do, you may not. It's not for me to say. But for now, it's been a real pleasure being with you. And please remember to join me on Twitter at Horoscope Ace, or the Daily Astrology and Video Show with Elisa and I. Please see the link beneath this video. Check out my affordable astrology reports or my testimonials if you'd like to consider having me looking over your situation in this kind of way too. Take care, good luck, and goodbye.